The annals of human darkness are seldom written in neat chronological order. They are more often unearthed, fragmented, and stained from the ashes of calamities that were never intended to reveal them. Such was the case with the Crane family dynasty, whose true and terrible history was not exhumed by the diligent work of lawmen or the intrepid inquiries of journalists, but by the indiscriminate fury of a fire. It was the afternoon of August 14, 1897, a day so profoundly hot and suffocatingly humid that the very air over Fort Wayne, Indiana, seemed to shimmer with a feverish malaise. The sky, a vast and indifferent canvas of pale hazy blue, offered no reprieve as the Crane Mansion, a Gothic behemoth of stone and ambition perched atop a hill overlooking the Maumee River, began to burn. The fire, which an official report would later attribute to faulty wiring in the East Wing's library, was an insatiable beast, consuming antique wood, priceless tapestries, and the carefully constructed facade of a family that had come to define the zenith of Gilded Age prosperity. As tongues of orange flame licked at the Indiana sky, a chaotic ballet of desperation unfolded on the manicured lawns below. Servants, their faces streaked with soot and panic, scurried from the inferno, their arms laden with whatever treasures they could salvage. Silver candelabras, porcelain heirlooms, and gold-framed portraits of the family's patriarch, the enigmatic Bartholomew Crane. It was during this frantic exodus that a young footman named Alistair Finch, his lungs aching from the smoke, stumbled and fell against a large, ornate bookshelf that lined the main hallway, a piece believed to have been imported from a German castle. The impact, jarring and clumsy, dislodged a section of the elaborate woodwork. Behind it, where only solid wall should have been, was a dark rectangular void, a hidden compartment, cunningly concealed and untouched by the passage of years. Driven by a mixture of terror and morbid curiosity, Alistair reached into the recess. His fingers brushed against the cool, supple texture of worn leather. He withdrew a heavy ledger-style journal, its cover stark and unadorned, save for the faint embossed initials BC. The air that escaped its pages as he opened it was not the musty, pleasant scent of old paper and ink, but something else entirely, an odor that would haunt Alistair for the remainder of his troubled life. He would later describe it to the few who would listen as a cloying metallic tang, reminiscent of a slaughterhouse, mingled with the acrid smell of coal smoke and something foully organic, a scent of profound and ancient decay. The journal's pages were filled, from margin to margin, with a hand that was unnervingly precise, a testament to a mind of meticulous and terrifying order. The entries were arranged in 3 stark columns. The first contained a list of names, over 400 of them, men, women, and even children. Names that belonged to the spectral ranks of the vanished individuals who had been swallowed by the burgeoning industrial landscape of northern Indiana over the preceding 15 years. The second column, titled Acquisition, was filled with dates, each one a silent tombstone marking the day a human life was claimed. But it was the third column that stopped the blood in Alistair's veins. Under the heading Disposition, next to each and every name, was a date of death, followed by a single chillingly sterile word, processed. The ledger was not a record of business transactions in any conventional sense. It was an almanac of human commodification, a logbook from a factory whose raw material was life itself. Alistair, clutching the foul-smelling book, fled the burning mansion, his mind reeling from a horror that had no name. The local constabulary, when they arrived, quickly took possession of the journal. Within a week, despite the ledger's earth-shattering implications, the investigation into Bartholomew Crane and his sprawling empire was officially, and inexplicably, closed. The city's officials cited a lack of credible evidence beyond the ramblings in a private diary, and the fire was ruled an accident. The truth, it seemed, was too monstrous, too deeply entangled with the city's own prosperity, to be allowed into the light. For 3 long years, the name Bartholomew Crane would continue to be spoken with a mixture of awe and reverence in the drawing rooms and boardrooms of the Midwest. His story remained the quintessential American fable, a testament to the transformative power of will and industry. But the story they told was a carefully curated fiction, a gilded cage built to conceal a charnel house. Before we delve into the labyrinthine darkness that was the Crane family, a dynasty whose foundations were built not on steel and commerce, but on systematic abduction and murder, it is essential to understand the world that allowed such a man to flourish. Fort Wayne in the 1880s was a city caught in the throes of a violent and glorious transformation. It was a crucible of the American dream, a place where the pastoral tranquility of the agrarian past was being brutally and irrevocably forged into the industrial future. The air, thick with the soot of 1,000 coal-fired furnaces, was the very breath of progress. Railroad tracks, like arteries of steel, crisscrossed the landscape, pumping raw materials in and finished goods out, the lifeblood of a nation drunk on its own manifest destiny. The city was a cacophony of creation, the rhythmic pounding of trip hammers, the deafening roar of Bessemer converters, the shriek of steam whistles, and the babble of languages spoken by the tide of immigrants who arrived daily, their eyes filled with a desperate hope for a new life. They came from Ireland, Germany, Poland, and Italy, drawn by the promise of work in the foundries and factories that were sprouting like iron weeds along the riverbanks. At the very epicenter of this industrial maelstrom stood the Crane Steel Works, a sprawling, smoke-belching complex that covered nearly 100 acres. It was a vision of hell, rendered in brick and iron, a place of perpetual fire and shadow, where nearly 3,000 men labored in conditions of extreme heat and danger to produce the finest steel west of the Allegheny Mountains. The steel from Crane's furnaces became the rails that stitched the country together, the skeletons of the first skyscrapers that scraped the clouds, and the machinery that would power the new century. The architect of this empire was a man as formidable and imposing as the industrial landscape he had created. Bartholomew Crane was a titan cast in the mold of the era's great industrialists, yet possessed of a peculiar and unsettling charisma that set him apart. He stood a commanding 6 feet and 3 inches tall, with a physique honed not in the drawing rooms of old money, but in the grueling labor of his youth. His eyes, a startlingly pale and piercing blue, seemed to possess an almost hypnotic quality, capable of assessing a man's worth or weakness in a single, penetrating glance. His hair, which had turned a dramatic, premature silver in his early 30s, was worn swept back from a high forehead, lending him an air of aristocratic gravitas that belied his humble origins. Born in 1847 to a family of struggling subsistence farmers in rural Ohio, Bartholomew was a product of hardship and ambition. He had received little formal education, but possessed a voracious, self-taught intellect and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. He arrived in Fort Wayne in his early 20s with nothing but the clothes on his back and a mind that saw the world not as it was, but as a collection of resources to be organized, controlled, and exploited for maximum efficiency. Through a combination of relentless work, shrewd investments, and a ruthlessness that often bordered on the predatory, he transformed himself from a common laborer into one of the most powerful and wealthy men in the Midwest. By 1885, at the age of just 38, his personal fortune was estimated to exceed $2 million, a staggering sum for the time, equivalent to a king's ransom today. His holdings were vast and diversified. Beyond the colossal Crane Steel Works, he owned thousands of acres of prime farmland, 3 smaller manufacturing plants producing everything from agricultural equipment to household goods, and a crucial short-line railroad that provided a direct link between Fort Wayne's industrial heart and the bustling markets of Chicago. This financial and industrial dominion placed him firmly within the pantheon of America's new royalty, the so-called robber barons, who were reshaping the nation in their own image. Yet, it was not Crane's immense wealth or his industrial acumen that made him a figure of whispered fascination and local legend. It was his radical and brazenly public approach to domestic life. In an era defined by rigid Victorian morality and strict social conventions, Bartholomew Crane lived as a veritable pasha, a modern-day patriarch presiding over a sprawling and complex family that defied every norm of Christian society. He made no secret of his polygamous arrangements, which he referred to with a disarming euphemism as his extended family. Unlike the secretive and persecuted Mormons of the distant Utah territories, Crane's domestic empire was operated with an almost theatrical openness, a defiant spectacle of wealth and unconventionality. The nerve center of this empire was Crane Manor, the 40-room Gothic revival mansion that loomed over the city like a dark fairy tale castle. With its soaring towers, crenellated battlements, and gargoyle-adorned facades, it was a monument to Crane's ambition and his contempt for convention. The manor was home to what the townsfolk, with a mixture of shock and grudging admiration, called the primary family. Here, in a state of apparent and unnerving harmony, lived 7 of Crane's wives and their 23 children. The internal logistics of the household were a marvel of organization, a reflection of the same meticulous efficiency Crane applied to his steel mills. Each wife was the mistress of her own private wing, a lavishly appointed suite of rooms that included a personal sitting room, bedrooms, and a fully staffed nursery for her own offspring. The arrangement was not one of lawless promiscuity, but was formalized through what Crane termed spiritual matrimony contracts. These legally intricate documents, drafted by a team of the finest lawyers in Indiana, provided each woman with a lifetime of financial security, legal protection for her children, and a share in Crane's estate. In return, they pledged their unwavering and exclusive devotion, not just to Bartholomew, but to the collective entity of the family unit. This was but the core of his domestic kingdom. Scattered throughout the verdant countryside of Allen County, Crane maintained 6 additional smaller estates. These properties, each a magnificent mansion in its own right, housed his secondary families. These were women who, for various reasons, preferred a more private existence away from the bustling social hub of Crane Manor, yet were still bound to him as wives, bearing his children and sharing in the immense prosperity his empire generated. There was Willowbrook Farm, a sprawling agricultural estate 20 miles south of the city, home to 5 wives and their 16 children. Riverside House, an elegant Georgian-style mansion nestled on the banks of the St. Mary's River, provided a sanctuary for another 4 wives and their 12 children. Each of these satellite estates was a self-contained world of luxury and privilege, complete with a full complement of servants, private tutors for the children, and governesses who ensured that every Crane heir received an education befitting their station. The most astonishing aspect of this complex web of relationships was its sheer, unadulterated openness. Bartholomew Crane was a man who lived his contradictions on a public stage. He would appear at a charity ball one evening with one wife on his arm, and attend Sunday church services the next morning accompanied by a different wife and her brood of impeccably dressed children. He hosted lavish garden parties and holiday galas at Crane Manor, where members of all his diaspora families would mingle with an air of sophisticated nonchalance that left Fort Wayne's high society both scandalized and utterly captivated. Initially, the city's elite reacted with predictable outrage and condemnation. Sermons were preached against the Sodom on the Mommy, and Crane was ostracized from the more conservative social circles. But the power of his wealth and influence was a tide that could not be turned back. His businesses employed a significant portion of the city's workforce. His philanthropic donations funded hospitals, orphanages, and public parks. His taxes filled the city's coffers. Gradually, pragmatic acceptance replaced moral indignation. Fort Wayne society, in a collective act of willful cognitive dissonance, came to view Crane's unorthodox lifestyle not as a sin, but as a peculiar, and perhaps even admirable social experiment. His wives, after all, were not downtrodden concubines, but elegant, cultured, and intelligent women who appeared to be genuinely content, even thriving within their unconventional arrangement. They were active in local charities, patronized the arts, and their impeccable fashion was the talk of the town. His children, numerous as they were models of Victorian propriety, polite, well-spoken, and consistently excelling in their academic pursuits. The local press, once critical, soon became a key instrument in the myth-making of the Crane dynasty. The society pages of the Fort Wayne Gazette ran glowing, feature-length profiles of Crane's various wives, celebrating their domestic management skills, their artistic talents, and their contributions to the city's cultural life. The Indianapolis Star sent a reporter to interview several of the older Crane children, publishing a laudatory article that praised their intelligence, their sophisticated worldview, and their devotion to their father. Even the city's religious leaders, who had once been his most vocal critics, began to soften their stance. In private conversations and eventually even in carefully worded public statements, they began to reframe Crane's polygamy as a novel and benevolent form of Christian charity. In an age where the ravages of war and industrial accidents had left a surplus of unmarried women, Crane, it was argued, was providing security, purpose, and a respectable life to women who might otherwise have faced a lonely and impoverished existence as spinsters. Among the city's businessmen and industrialists, Crane was a figure of almost mythical stature. They admired not only his Midas touch in the world of commerce, but what they saw as his genius for domestic management. At their exclusive men's clubs, over cigars and brandy, they would joke about his legendary diplomatic skills, marveling at his ability to maintain peace and harmony among so many strong-willed women. Some, only half-jokingly, would seek his counsel on how to manage their own, far simpler single-wife households. Crane would receive such praise with a gracious, knowing smile, his blue eyes twinkling. The secret, he would often remark, his voice a low, resonant baritone, is quite simple. You must treat each woman as if she were the only woman in the world. Convince her of her singular importance, and she will reward you with a loyalty that transcends all earthly convention. But behind this meticulously polished facade of domestic tranquility and enlightened patriarchy, there were subtle discordant notes, faint whispers of a darkness that defied the glowing public narrative. Cracks were beginning to appear in the perfect veneer of the Crane family's world, visible only to those who looked closely enough. Journalists, when interviewing the wives, would sometimes find their questions gently but firmly deflected. If, pressed about certain areas of the sprawling manor, particularly the basement and sections of the West Wing, the women's composed expressions would falter. They would speak vaguely of Mr. Crane's private business areas, places that were strictly off limits to all family members. Their eyes would betray a flicker of something that looked less like discretion and more like a deeply ingrained fear. They spoke of strange, unmarked wagons that made deliveries to the estate in the dead of night, of unfamiliar men who came and went at odd hours, their faces grim and purposeful. They mentioned the sounds of heavy machinery operating at strange times, a low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to emanate from deep beneath the earth. When asked to elaborate on these peculiarities, the wives would invariably change the subject, their polite smiles becoming strained, their carefully rehearsed composure momentarily breaking. The children, in their unguarded innocence, occasionally offered even more disturbing glimpses into the family's hidden reality. Edmund, Crane's 10-year-old son from his third wife, once confided to a school friend that his father had a special workshop in the basement, a place where bad people were sent to learn how to be good again. He spoke of it not with fear, but with a child's simple acceptance of a household rule. 12-year-old Margaret, a thoughtful and quiet girl, mentioned to her music tutor that she was sometimes kept awake at night by what she described as sad singing, a faint, mournful chorus that seemed to rise up from beneath the floorboards of the grand library. When the adults in their lives questioned them further about these strange statements, the children would grow confused and agitated, often claiming they couldn't remember what they had said, as if a veil had been drawn over a forbidden memory. The most unsettling observations, however, came from the servants and groundskeepers who worked on the Crane estates. These were people who existed in the liminal spaces of the great houses, seeing and hearing things not meant for public consumption. Several of the laundry maids reported finding strange, dark stains on bed linens and clothing that came down from the manor's restricted areas, stains that, despite their best efforts with lye soap, they could not fully remove, and which they swore were blood. Groundskeepers who worked near the basement entrances spoke of seeing unusual tools and pieces of industrial equipment being delivered, items that seemed to have no place in a domestic residence. Heavy iron chains, large metal vats, and what one man described as a custom-built furnace, bigger than any boiler I've ever seen. The kitchen staff, who were responsible for feeding the massive household, were perplexed by the sheer quantity of food that was prepared each day. They cooked enormous vats of stew, baked dozens of loaves of bread, and peeled mountains of potatoes, far more than could possibly be consumed by the known residents of the estate, even counting the numerous children and live-in staff. Yet, no large parties were ever announced, and no official guests were ever seen dining at the manor. The food simply disappeared, sent down to the lower levels on dumbwaiters, destined for unseen and unknown mouths. The wives themselves, for all their outward contentment, exhibited subtle behaviors that suggested a life lived under immense and constant strain. They rarely, if ever, left the estate grounds alone, always accompanied by a chaperone or a driver handpicked by Crane. They seemed intensely reluctant to speak of their lives before they had married into the Crane family, deflecting all inquiries with vague pleasantries. Most tellingly, not a single one of them appeared to have any contact with their own families of origin. No letters from parents, no visits from siblings. He explained this away by claiming that, by a remarkable coincidence, all of his wives had been either orphans or had become estranged from relatives who disapproved of their unconventional lifestyle choice. It was a plausible, if statistically improbable, explanation that, like so much else about the Crane family, was accepted without serious question. By the dawn of 1890, Bartholomew Crane's dual reputation as an industrial visionary and a master of domestic innovation was firmly established. He was the living embodiment of the Gilded Age's contradictions, a man who had seemingly tamed both the brutalities of the factory and the complexities of the human heart. His fame had spread far beyond the borders of Indiana. Businessmen, sociologists, and journalists came from as far away as New York City and San Francisco to tour his state-of-the-art steelworks and to marvel at his unique family arrangements, hoping to glean some secret from his unprecedented success. His name was frequently floated in the state's newspapers as a future candidate for governor, with glowing editorials praising his bold, forward-thinking approaches to both commerce and social organization. The future seemed limitless for the man who had, to all appearances, conquered the age-old human problems of loneliness and economic want by simply rewriting the rules. But even as his public star ascended to its zenith, a different, darker narrative was beginning to take shape in the shadows of his empire. In the crowded, impoverished immigrant neighborhoods on the east side of Fort Wayne, and in the transient hobo camps that clung to the edges of the railroad lines, whispers began to circulate. They were stories of people who had gone to the Crane Steelworks seeking employment and had never returned. Tales of men who had simply vanished from their boarding house rooms, leaving all their meager possessions behind. There were rumors of shadowy figures, agents of Crane who prowled the city's poorest districts, making fantastical offers of high-paying jobs and company housing to the desperate and the destitute, offers that seemed too good to be true, and always were. There were reports from frantic relatives about entire families who had answered newspaper advertisements for domestic positions at one of the several Crane estates, and who had subsequently disappeared from the face of the earth, their letters home abruptly ceasing, their existence seemingly erased. These whispers, for a time, remained just that, the paranoid murmurings of society's most marginalized and vulnerable members, easily dismissed by the powerful as the fantasies of the uneducated and the unstable. They might have faded into the industrial smog of the city, forgotten and ignored, had it not been for the events that transpired on a cold, rain-lashed evening in October of 1890. It was on this night that the first undeniable crack appeared in the magnificent, carefully constructed edifice of Bartholomew Crane's empire of prosperity and desire, a crack that would eventually widen to reveal the horrifying rotten core within. The autumn of 1890 was a season of unprecedented economic fervor in the Midwest, a boom that brought with it an acute and persistent labor shortage to Fort Wayne's burgeoning industrial sector. The city's factories were expanding at a dizzying pace, fueled by a seemingly insatiable demand for American-manufactured goods. This created a fiercely competitive market for labor, with factory owners finding themselves in the unaccustomed position of having to woo workers. They offered signing bonuses, promised higher wages, and even sent recruitment agents to the immigrant processing centers of the East Coast. In this climate of scarcity, the situation at the Crane Steelworks was a profound and deeply puzzling anomaly. While his competitors scrambled to fill their shifts, Bartholomew Crane seemed to operate in a different reality, one where the laws of supply and demand did not apply. He never advertised for workers, never raised his wages, and yet his factories were always fully staffed. His workforce seemed to be a self-replenishing organism, a river of humanity that flowed endlessly through his gates. New faces appeared on the foundry floors with an almost daily regularity. They were often gaunt, quiet men with haunted eyes, men who worked with a strange mechanical efficiency, never complaining, never socializing, and seemingly content with wages that were, in fact, significantly lower than the prevailing rates offered by other mills in the area. When his fellow industrialists would question him about his seemingly magical recruitment methods, Crane would simply offer one of his enigmatic smiles. A reputation for fair treatment and a stable work environment, he would explain smoothly, is the most effective recruitment tool a man can possess. The best workers are naturally drawn to the best-run operations. The truth, as a handful of people were beginning to suspect, was infinitely more complex and unimaginably sinister. Thomas O'Brien was one of those people. A barrel-chested Irish immigrant with a face like a roadmap of his own hard life, O'Brien had worked his way up to the position of foreman at the Crane Steelworks over the course of 8 grueling years. He was a good foreman, tough but fair, and he knew the rhythms of the steel mill, the faces of its men, and the smell of its dangers as well as he knew his own name. And for the past year, he had been noticing things that disturbed him, patterns that defied logic and chilled him with the vague nameless dread. Unlike other factories, where men formed bonds of camaraderie forged in shared labor and peril, the workforce at Crane's mill was characterized by a bizarre and unsettling transience. Men would appear, work their shifts with a silent, almost robotic diligence, and then, after a period of a few weeks or perhaps a few months, they would simply vanish. There were no goodbyes, no 2 weeks' notices, no stories of moving on to a better job. One day a man would be working at the furnace next to you. The next, his position would be filled by a new, equally silent stranger. O'Brien had initially dismissed this high turnover rate as a natural consequence of the brutal nature of steelwork. It was a job that broke men's bodies and spirits, and he assumed the inexperienced or the weak were simply drifting away in search of easier employment. But as he began to pay closer attention, keeping a small private logbook of his own, he realized the disappearances followed no discernible pattern. It wasn't just the greenhorns who vanished. Some of the men who disappeared were among his most skilled and experienced workers. Veteran foundrymen from the industrial heartlands of Germany and Ireland. Men who had sought him out specifically for the promise of steady, long-term employment. Others were strapping young men from local farming communities, men with wives and young children to support, who had spoken to O'Brien at length about their plans to save money and buy a small plot of land. These were not men who would simply walk away from a steady paycheck. Most disturbing to O'Brien was the fact that several of the men who had vanished were men he had come to know personally. He had shared a pipe with them after a long shift, listened to their stories, and heard their hopes for the future. He knew about the families they were planning to send for. The houses they dreamed of building, the Kiint. See were men with roots, men who had every intention of making a permanent life in Fort Wayne. O'Brien's unease curdled into outright suspicion, and he began a quiet, cautious investigation of his own. He started by visiting the boarding houses in the immigrant quarter where many of the single workers lived. In each case, he found the same eerie scene. The men's rooms had been completely emptied, their few meager possessions gone. The landlords claiming the tenant had paid his rent in full and left without a word. It was too clean, too neat, as if their very existence had been scrubbed away. He made discreet inquiries at the city's railroad station, asking the ticket clerks if they recalled selling tickets to any of the missing men. The clerks, after checking their logs, could find no record of their travel. It was as if they had walked out of the factory gates and simply dissolved into thin air. The most chilling discovery came when O'Brien, driven by a gnawing sense of responsibility, sought out the local families of the workers who had disappeared. He found them not in a state of panic, but of anxious waiting. Each family had received a letter, ostensibly from their missing loved one. The letters, postmarked from distant cities like St. Louis or Cleveland, all told a similar story. The man had found a sudden, wonderful new job opportunity, one too good to pass up, and would send for his family as soon as he was settled. The letters were remarkably convincing, filled with personal details and inside jokes that seemed to confirm their authenticity. They spoke of shared memories and future plans, perfectly mimicking the voice and personality of the man who had supposedly written them. Yet, as O'Brien examined several of these letters, a cold dread began to seep into his bones. While the handwriting in each letter was different, there were subtle, almost imperceptible similarities in the formation of certain letters, a shared stylistic quirk that suggested a single, skilled hand attempting to imitate multiple different scripts. But there was something else, something that made the hair on O'Brien's arms stand on end. Several of the letters contained highly specific, intimate details about the men's lives, stories about their childhoods, their private fears, their most deeply held dreams, details that O'Brien knew for a fact the men had shared with no one else but him, during quiet, confidential conversations in the deafening roar of the foundry. Someone was not just forging letters, they were mining the private confessions of men and weaponizing their hopes to create a cruel and calculated deception. Determined to uncover the truth, O'Brien altered his own routine. He began arriving at the steelworks in the cold pre-dawn darkness and staying long after the last whistle had blown, hiding in the shadows of the sprawling complex, watching and waiting. What he witnessed over the next several weeks confirmed that he had stumbled upon a clandestine operation of terrifying scope and efficiency. In the liminal hours between the end of the night shift and the start of the day shift, under the cloak of darkness, the factory's rear entrance became a hub of sinister activity. A procession of unmarked, horse-drawn wagons would arrive, their drivers heavily muffled in coats and hats, their faces obscured. The cargo of these wagons was human. Groups of people, men, women, and sometimes even young children, would be unloaded. They moved with a strange, stumbling gait, a listless, shuffling motion that suggested they were either utterly exhausted, drugged, or both. These new arrivals were not taken through the main employee entrance. Instead, they were led directly into a windowless, fortified section of the steelworks that O'Brien had always been told was used for the storage of volatile chemicals and raw materials. He watched, night after night, and realized with a growing horror that the people who went into that section of the factory during these pre-dawn deliveries were never seen coming out during regular working hours. Instead, different men would emerge to take their places on the foundry floor, men who bore no resemblance to the individuals brought in the wagons, but who somehow carried the same work clothes and lunch pails. It was a gruesome and efficient system of replacement. O'Brien knew he had to see where the wagons were coming from, or where they went after their grim deliveries. His investigation took a perilous turn one moonless November night, when he decided to follow one of the wagons as it left the steelworks. He kept his distance, a lone figure on a borrowed horse, his heart pounding in his chest. The wagon did not travel towards the city's boarding houses or residential districts. Instead, it rumbled deep into the countryside, taking a series of winding, unfamiliar roads. After nearly an hour of tense pursuit, the wagon turned onto a long private drive, flanked by imposing stone pillars. The road led directly to the one place O'Brien had feared it would, Crane Manor, its dark towers silhouetted against the starless sky. Concealed within a thick grove of ancient oak trees, O'Brien watched, his breath catching in his throat. The wagon pulled up to a discreet basement entrance at the rear of the mansion. The cargo was unloaded under the watchful eyes of several large, grim-faced men. There were approximately a dozen people, moving with that same eerie, drugged listlessness he had seen at the factory. But these were not the hardened, working-class men he had expected to see. Among them were well-dressed women, frail-looking elderly couples, and several children who appeared to be either asleep or unconscious. All were being herded or carried from the wagon into the depths of the mansion's basement. And then O'Brien saw a face that turned his blood to ice. One of the women, her head lolling on the shoulder of the man carrying her, was Catherine MacLeod. She was the young, distraught widow of a Scottish immigrant named Angus MacLeod, a skilled smelter who had worked at the foundry for a few months before his own mysterious disappearance 6 months prior. O'Brien remembered Catherine well. She had come to the factory every week for months, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, desperately asking if anyone had heard any news of her husband. Now, here she was, unconscious, being carried into the basement of Bartholomew Crane's palatial estate. In that single horrifying moment, the disparate, terrifying pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in O'Brien's mind. This wasn't about unconventional labor recruitment. This was a sophisticated, large-scale kidnapping operation. The people being brought to Crane Manor were not willing workers. They were victims. The entire operation was masterfully organized, involving multiple locations, a fleet of vehicles, and a team of disciplined accomplices. And it had been operating right under the nose of the entire city for years. The very next morning, a shaken but resolute O'Brien went to the office of the Allen County Sheriff to report what he had seen. He found himself facing a wall of deliberate and hostile indifference. Sheriff William Hendricks, a portly, complacent man whose political career had been largely funded by Crane's largesse, listened to O'Brien's frantic, detailed account with an expression of barely concealed irritation. When O'Brien finished, the sheriff leaned back in his creaking chair, the leather groaning in protest, and fixed him with a cold, dismissive glare. "Thomas O'Brien," he said, his voice slow and heavy with condescension. "Are you fully aware of who you are accusing? You are talking about Mr. Bartholomew Crane, the most respected, most charitable man in this state. He employs half this damn county. Are you seriously suggesting, on the basis of some shadows you claim to have seen in the dark, that he is involved in kidnapping?" O'Brien, desperate, insisted that he was telling the truth, offering to lead the sheriff to the very spots where he had witnessed the deliveries. But Hendricks waved a dismissive hand, refusing to even consider an investigation. He accused O'Brien of being a drunkard and a troublemaker, suggesting his story was a hallucination brought on by overwork and cheap whiskey. When O'Brien persisted, his voice rising with frustration, the sheriff's tone turned menacing. He threatened to have O'Brien arrested for public intoxication and disturbing the peace, making it clear that the matter was closed. Frustrated and now deeply afraid, O'Brien's next stop was the office of the Fort Wayne Gazette. He hoped that the press, the supposed watchdog of the public trust, would be interested in his explosive story. The editor, a man named Silas Croft, listened to O'Brien's account with a polite, professional attentiveness that gave O'Brien a fleeting sense of hope. But when the story was told, Croft's expression turned regretful. He explained in a frank and businesslike tone that the newspaper was almost entirely dependent on the substantial advertising revenue it received from Crane's myriad businesses. To publish such unsubstantiated and inflammatory allegations against the paper's most important financial benefactor would be, he stated bluntly, an act of journalistic and financial suicide. O'Brien left the newspaper office with the sickening realization that he was caught in an invisible, suffocating web. Bartholomew Crane had not just built an industrial empire. He had bought an entire city. Every institution that was supposed to provide checks and balance, law enforcement, the press, local government, even the churches that benefited from his tithing, was entangled in a web of financial dependency on him. The steel magnate had brilliantly, diabolically, made himself indispensable to the community's very survival. To challenge him was to challenge the economic bedrock of the entire region. But Thomas O'Brien was not entirely alone in his horrifying knowledge. Across town, in the quiet, austere halls of the St. Jude's Catholic Orphanage, another person had been independently chronicling the city's growing list of the vanished. Sister Margaret O'Connell, the orphanage's formidable and compassionate director, had been keeping her own set of meticulous, secret records. For the past 2 years, her office had become an unofficial clearinghouse for desperate inquiries from families across the Midwest who were searching for relatives that had last been seen heading to Fort Wayne in search of work. Her files told a story that was, in some ways, even more disturbing than what O'Brien had uncovered. The missing persons in her records were not just single, working-age men. They were entire families, husbands, wives, and children, who had answered newspaper advertisements for domestic staff positions at the various Crane properties. These families, lured by the promise of good wages, comfortable lodging, and a better life, had been hired for positions as groundskeepers, housemaids, cooks, and tutors. Once they reported for their first day of work at one of the Crane estates, they seemed to vanish from the earth as completely as if they had never existed. Sister Margaret, a woman not easily intimidated, had attempted to make her own inquiries. She had visited several of the Crane estates, asking to speak with the families she knew had been hired. In each instance, she was met at the gates by stern, unyielding security guards who informed her that the families in question had found better opportunities elsewhere and had moved on without leaving a forwarding address. When Sister Margaret persisted, her inquiries growing more pointed, she received a personal visit at the orphanage from Bartholomew Crane himself. He arrived in his opulent carriage bearing a donation so substantial it could fund the orphanage's entire operating budget for a full year. He presented the check with his famous charm, but his words carried a velvet-gloved threat. He gently but firmly suggested that her time and energy would be far better spent caring for the living children under her roof, rather than pursuing unfounded and potentially distressing rumors about his household staff. The message was unmistakable. The donation was not charity. It was hush money. Faced with an impossible choice, pursue a dangerous and likely fruitless investigation that could lead to her ruin, or accept the money that would ensure the survival of the dozens of homeless children in her care. The nun, with a heavy and compromised heart, reluctantly accepted Crane's terms. The questions about the missing families would have to cease. By the spring of 1891, a thick, suffocating blanket of conspired silence had descended upon Fort Wayne. Those few individuals who knew or suspected the horrifying truth of Crane's activities found themselves isolated, intimidated, and utterly powerless. They were trapped by their own economic vulnerability and by a community's collective, desperate unwillingness to confront the monster who was its greatest benefactor. And so, the disappearances continued. The mysterious wagons continued their nocturnal journeys under the cover of darkness. And Bartholomew Crane's public reputation as a pillar of the community, a benevolent industrialist and a pioneering family man, remained as polished and unassailable as the steel produced in his foundries. But beneath the placid surface of this enforced silence, a dangerous pressure was building. In his small boarding house room, Thomas O'Brien continued his lonely, nocturnal surveillance, meticulously documenting every suspicious movement he observed in a small coded journal that he kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard. At the orphanage, Sister Margaret continued to secretly file away the letters from searching families, her conscience warring with her pragmatism, as she looked for patterns that might one day constitute undeniable proof. And most significantly, within the opulent gilded cage of Crane Manor itself, several of Crane's own wives, the supposed beneficiaries of his grand social experiment, had begun to ask their own dangerous questions. The perfect facade of domestic bliss, the very foundation of the Crane myth, was beginning to show cracks. And soon, those cracks would widen into a chasm, exposing the terrifying truth that festered in the darkness below. The autumn of 1891 descended upon Crane Manor with a palpable shift in its internal climate, a subtle but pervasive chill that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. The women of the house, the celebrated wives of Bartholomew Crane, who had once glided through the mansion's opulent corridors with the serene confidence of queens in their own kingdom, now moved with a new, tentative caution. Their conversations, once lively and filling the grand halls with laughter, were now conducted in hushed, conspiratorial tones. Their eyes, which once shone with contentment, now darted nervously towards the forbidden sections of the house, as if they feared the very walls had begun to whisper the secrets they held. At the apex of this complex and now fearful domestic hierarchy was Eleanor Hartwell. She had been Crane's first wife, married to him in a modest ceremony back in 1878, long before the fortune and the fame, back when he was just a fiercely ambitious steelworker with a hypnotic gaze and dreams that seemed far too large for his station. Over the 13 years of their unique and evolving marriage, she had been a first-hand witness to his astonishing metamorphosis, watching him transform from a charming, penniless suito into one of the most formidable industrialists in the nation. With a methodical, dispassionate precision she had once found thrilling, she had also watched him acquire additional wives, accumulating them with the same strategic acumen he applied to the acquisition of foundries and railroad lines. Eleanor's position as the senior wife afforded her a certain authority and a unique set of responsibilities within the household. She was the de facto general of the domestic staff, the coordinator of the children's complex educational schedules, and Crane's official hostess at the many social functions that were essential to maintaining his public image. These duties also granted her access to the logistical and financial inner workings of the estate, a level of information that the other wives were not privy to. And by the autumn of 1891, the information she was seeing in the household's meticulously kept account books was causing her a growing and profound distress. The ledgers, which she reviewed on a monthly basis, were filled with expenditures that made no logical sense within the context of their known family life. The grocery bills were astronomical, detailing the purchase of enough food each week to feed a small army, at least 3 times the number of people who officially resided at the manor. The orders from the apothecary were equally baffling. Medical supplies such as laudanum, bandages, and surgical spirits were being purchased in quantities that suggested the operation of a small clandestine clinic somewhere within the estate's walls. Most perplexing were the substantial regular cash payments made to a list of individuals Eleanor had never met, their names unfamiliar, their listed services cryptically described as consulting or procurement. When Eleanor, in her gentle but persistent manner, had first questioned her husband about these anomalies, his explanations were as smooth and polished as his public persona. The extra food, he explained, was for the staff of his various businesses, and for a private charitable kitchen he operated for the city's poor. The medical supplies were for a private infirmary he had established to provide care for injured steelworks employees, a benefit he preferred to keep quiet to avoid the appearance of ostentation. The cash payments, he claimed, were for business associates and informants whose identities needed to be protected for competitive reasons. Each explanation was plausible on its own, delivered with the patient, condescending tone of a man explaining complex matters to a woman of limited understanding. But they failed to account for the sheer industrial scale of the expenditures, nor did they explain why these supposed charitable activities were kept so secret, never once mentioned in the newspaper articles that celebrated his philanthropy. Eleanor's anxieties deepened as she observed a disquieting turnover in the household staff. Several of the long-serving maids and footmen, servants who had been with the family for years, had been abruptly dismissed and replaced by a new cohort of employees. These new servants were different. They were sullen, secretive, and moved with a nervous energy that set the entire household on edge. They worked unconventional shifts, arriving in the pre-dawn darkness and leaving late at night, and their duties were confined exclusively to the restricted areas of the mansion, the basement and the west wing, which the family was strictly forbidden from entering. Most disturbing of all were the sounds. In the dead of night, when the great house was supposed to be wrapped in slumber, Eleanor would lie awake, her ear pressed to the floor, steaming. She would hear the low, persistent hum of what sounded like heavy machinery operating deep within the foundations of the building. Sometimes, carried on the air through the heating vents, she would hear voices, not the familiar tones of her family or the regular staff, but the guttural sounds of strangers, speaking in languages she could not place, perhaps German or Polish. And on some nights, faint and fleeting, she would hear other sounds that made her skin crawl and her heart pound against her ribs. She heard what sounded like weeping, a low, desperate sobbing that seemed to come from many throats. She heard pleading, the sound of voices raised in anguish, quickly muffled. The sounds were so faint, so intermittent, that she often wondered if she was imagining them, if the strain of her life was causing her mind to fracture. Eleanor began to subtly and cautiously share her fears with the other senior wives, women with whom she had forged a complex bond of sisterly solidarity and quiet rivalry. She discovered that she was not alone in her observations. Margaret Sullivan, Crane's third wife, a fiery Irish woman with a sharp wit, reported that her youngest children had been plagued by nightmares. They spoke of the sad people who live in the walls and the noisy men under the floor. Victoria Welsh, the fifth wife, a quiet and observant woman, confided that her teenage daughter had sworn she had seen unfamiliar, pale faces peering out from the windows of the West Wing, a section of the manor that was supposed to be entirely unoccupied. The wives, their shared fear acting as a powerful catalyst, began to hold clandestine meetings in the privacy of Eleanor's sitting room, pooling their observations and piecing together a terrifying mosaic of deception. Each woman held a different fragment of the puzzle. The mysterious nocturnal deliveries, their husbands' frequent and unexplained absences, the strange foul odors that sometimes emanated from the basement vents, and the unsettling presence of a shadow population that seemed to inhabit the hidden spaces of their home. Their furtive investigation took a dramatic and frightening turn when Margaret Sullivan, acting on a hunch born of a childhood spent in a rambling, secret-filled Irish castle, discovered a hidden mechanism behind a loose panel on a library bookshelf. The panel slid open to reveal not a safe, but a dark, narrow passageway and a steep flight of stone stairs that descended into the earth, far deeper than any of the known cellar levels. The air that rose from the stairwell was cold and carried the same foul metallic scent that Eleanor had noticed on the laundry. To descend those stairs required a courage that bordered on recklessness, but Margaret's determination to understand the truth of what was happening in her own home had become an obsession that overshadowed her fear. She followed the winding staircase down into the pitch-black depths. It ended at a massive iron-reinforced wooden door, secured with a series of heavy industrial-grade locks. Pressing her ear to the cold wood, Margaret's blood ran cold. The sounds from the other side were now unmistakable, no longer faint or imagined. There were people beyond the door, many of them. She could hear the distinct sounds of children coughing, of women weeping, and the low, pained moans of men. And underpinning it all was the ceaseless, rhythmic clang and grind of machinery, the sound of a factory operating in the bowels of their home. When Margaret, pale and trembling, reported her discovery to the other wives, they were faced with a terrible and paralyzing dilemma. They now possessed near certain knowledge that their husband, The man who had promised them a life of security and luxury was holding people captive directly beneath their feet. But they had no tangible proof, no way to alert the outside world without confronting Crane himself. Such a confrontation, they knew, would not only mean the immediate and violent end to their privileged existence, but could place them and their beloved children in unimaginable danger. If Bartholomew was capable of imprisoning strangers in his basement, what horrors might he be capable of inflicting upon the wives who dared to betray him? The decision of what to do was brutally made for them a few weeks later, in early December of 1891. 7-year-old Timothy Crane, Eleanor's youngest and most adventurous son, vanished. The boy had been playing hide-and-seek in the manor's sprawling west wing, and then, simply, he was gone. For several frantic hours, the household was thrown into a state of panic. A search was mounted, with servants and family members combing every room and corner of the vast estate. Timothy was eventually found, not hiding in a closet, but sound asleep in his own bed, with no memory of where he had been for the past 4 hours, or how he had returned to his room. But Timothy's brief, unexplained disappearance was accompanied by a host of disturbing clues. His clothes, which had been freshly laundered that morning, were now covered in a fine, dark soot and smelled strongly of that same signature metallic chemical odor that permeated the lower levels of the manor. More alarmingly, the boy had developed a severe hacking cough and complained of a raw, sore throat, symptoms consistent with exposure to industrial smoke or chemical fumes. When Eleanor gently questioned her son about his missing hours, Timothy became distressed and agitated. In a fragmented, dreamlike narrative, he began to speak of the working people, downstairs, and the sad place where nobody is ever allowed to leave. He described a vast, noisy room filled with lots and lots of people, and the loud banging sounds that never, ever stop. Most chillingly, Timothy claimed that a man, not his father, had told him he was going to learn about the family business, but that he had been brought back to his room because he was too little to understand the work. Eleanor realized with a wave of nauseating horror that her young son had somehow stumbled into the hidden subterranean world of the manor. He had witnessed firsthand the secret activities Crane was conducting in the basement. The fact that Timothy had been drugged or otherwise coerced into forgetting the experience was a terrifying escalation. It proved that Crane was willing to use his sinister methods even on his own children to protect the sanctity of his secrets. The wives' burgeoning knowledge of their husband's criminality placed them in an increasingly desperate and untenable position. They were trapped. They could not flee, as Crane controlled every penny of their finances and held absolute legal custody of their children. They could not go to the authorities in Fort Wayne, for they knew the city's officials were firmly in Crane's pocket. They now understood, with a terrifying clarity, that they were living on the lid of a human pressure cooker, a hidden prison where dozens of souls were being held in abject misery. Their perilous situation grew even more acute when Crane's demeanor towards them began to change. He became suspicious, watchful. He started asking pointed, probing questions about their daily conversations and routines. He would appear unexpectedly in their private wings, his piercing blue eyes searching for any sign of collusion or dissent. He assigned specific, thuggish-looking new servants to act as their personal minders, their movements now monitored around the clock. The atmosphere in the manor, once one of unconventional but genuine warmth, became thick with paranoia and unspoken terror. The wives were forced to perform a delicate and exhausting charade, maintaining the public illusion of domestic bliss while privately consumed by the knowledge that their husband was a monster. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle, the one that confirmed their worst fears and revealed the true depraved nature of Crane's operations, fell into place in January of 1892. It was Margaret Sullivan who found it. While searching for a place to hide the notes from their secret meetings, she discovered a loose floorboard beneath the carpet in her bedroom. Prying it up, she found a hidden cache. It was a collection of personal effects, a pathetic trove of stolen memories, women's jewelry, family photographs, bundles of letters tied with ribbon, and official identification documents. They were the last vestiges of the lives of dozens of different people, the very people who had vanished from the Fort Wayne area over the past several years. Among these tragic mementos, Margaret found one item that made her gasp and drop the entire collection. It was a letter, written in a desperate, pleading hand. It was addressed to Sheriff Hendricks and was signed by Catherine MacLeod, the young Scottish widow. In the letter, Catherine begged the sheriff for help in finding her husband, Angus, who had disappeared from the steelworks. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before the night that O'Brien, from his hiding place in the woods, had watched Catherine herself being carried, unconscious, into the basement of Crane Manor. In that moment, Margaret and the other wives understood. They were not just living with a kidnapper and an illegal slaver. They were living with a man who systematically hunted and destroyed entire families. A predator who fed on the hopes of the vulnerable. Their beautiful home, their sanctuary, was in fact the operational headquarters of a vast criminal enterprise. But even this soul-shattering discovery was not the final revelation. The true unbelievable scope of Bartholomew Crane's depravity and the ultimate unspeakable fate of his hundreds of victims would only be uncovered when one of their own number, a woman of extraordinary intellect and courage, decided to risk everything to descend into the heart of the nightmare that existed directly beneath their feet. Rebecca Fleming was not like the other wives of Bartholomew Crane. She had always possessed a quality of intellectual fire and fierce independence that set her apart. A former schoolteacher from Chicago with a keen analytical mind, she had married Crane in 1889, drawn to his powerful intellect and his grand, unconventional vision of the world. It was this very independence of thought, which Crane had initially found so attractive, that he now seemed to view with growing suspicion and discomfort. While the other wives had, over the years, been lulled into a state of passive acceptance by the sheer luxury and isolation of their lives, Rebecca had never stopped questioning. She saw the world as a series of puzzles to be solved, and the ever-deepening mysteries of Crane Manor had become the most compelling and dangerous puzzle of her life. Her chance to finally seek the answers came in early February of 1892. Crane announced he would be traveling to Pittsburgh for a series of business meetings, an extended trip that was expected to keep him away for at least 2 weeks. For the first time since she had arrived at the manor 3 years prior, Rebecca found herself free from the constant, oppressive weight of her husband's scrutiny and the watchful eyes of his personal guards. She knew this was her only opportunity. For months, Rebecca had been secretly studying the architectural plans of the manor, copies of which she had found in the Public Records Office in Fort Wayne. She had spent countless hours comparing the original 1883 blueprint with the plans for the extensive additions and modifications that Crane had commissioned in the subsequent years. She had noticed numerous structural inconsistencies, walls that were thicker than they needed to be, ventilation systems that seemed oversized for a residential dwelling, and entire sections of the foundation that were unaccounted for in the official schematics. These modifications, she suspected, were not designed merely to accommodate Crane's expanding family, but to create a hidden, subterranean architecture, a secret geography concealed within the visible one. Her late father had been a prominent Chicago architect, and from him, she had inherited not just an analytical mind, but a practical understanding of building construction. She knew how to read the language of stone and mortar, how to identify the telltale signs of hidden passages and concealed chambers. Armed with this knowledge, and with a courage born of desperation, she began her systematic exploration of the manor's secret world. Her descent began in the dead of night, the great house silent around her, the only sound the frantic beating of her own heart. She made her way to the library and opened the hidden passage behind the bookshelf that Margaret had discovered. She followed the narrow, spiraling stone staircase down into the cold, damp earth. But when she reached the massive, locked wooden door at its base, she did not try to force it. Instead, she began to meticulously examine the surrounding stonework, her fingers tracing the mortar lines, tapping gently on the stones, listening for the hollow sound that would betray a hidden void. Her knowledge of architecture paid off. She discovered another concealed mechanism, a loose stone that, when pressed, caused an entire section of the wall to pivot inward, revealing an alternative route into the underground complex, bypassing the locked main entrance. The world Rebecca stepped into was a scene from Dante's Inferno, a vision of industrial hell that would be forever seared into her memory. The basement of Crane Manor was not a cellar. It was a labyrinthine, multi-level factory, a clandestine industrial operation of shocking scale and sophistication. The interconnected chambers were filled with heavy machinery, small-scale Bessemer converters, metal lathes, stamping presses, and forges, all adapted for operation in a confined, underground space. But it was not the machinery that was the most horrifying aspect of this hidden world. It was the workforce. Dozens upon dozens of people were imprisoned in these subterranean chambers, living and working in conditions of unimaginable squalor and brutality. Men, women, and even children as young as 10 were literally chained to their workstations, their ankles raw and bleeding from the iron shackles. They were the missing people of Fort Wayne, a ghostly, emaciated cross-section of the city's dispossessed. German immigrant families, Irish railroad workers, destitute farmers, and the homeless who had been swept from the city's streets. They toiled in near-total darkness, the air thick with toxic fumes and the deafening, ceaseless clang of machinery. They worked in grueling shifts that often lasted 18 to 20 hours, followed by brief, inadequate periods of rest on thin, filthy straw mattresses laid directly upon the cold, damp stone floors. Their compliance was ensured through a brutal trinity of control: physical restraints, systematic starvation, and regular forced doses of laudanum, the opiate dulling their minds and senses, rendering them docile, confused, and incapable of organized resistance. In a flash of horrifying insight, Rebecca understood the true source of her husband's miraculous business success. While his competitors grappled with rising labor costs, on disputes, and worker strikes, Bartholomew Crane had engineered the ultimate solution: a disposable, cost-free slave workforce, replenished by a steady stream of kidnapped victims. The celebrated high-quality steel products that had made him a legend were being forged by human beings who had been stolen from their lives, stripped of their identities, and forced to work until they collapsed and died. But as she ventured deeper into the labyrinth, Rebecca discovered that the horrors of slave labor were not the final, deepest circle of this domestic hell. In the most remote and heavily fortified chambers of the complex, she found out what happened to the prisoners who became too sick, too weak, or too defiant to continue working. These individuals were not given medical care. They were not even granted the mercy of a quick death. They were taken to the final chamber, a room that housed a large, specially designed furnace. It was not a furnace for smelting steel. It was an incinerator, built for the sole purpose of disposing of human remains. Here, the bodies of the dead and the dying were fed into the roaring flames, where they were consumed by the intense heat, utterly destroyed until nothing remained but a fine, gray ash and the calcified, mineral-rich fragments of their bones. And here, Rebecca made the discovery that pushed her to the very brink of sanity. This mineral residue, the final physical remnant of Crane's victims, was not simply discarded. It was collected, pulverized into a fine powder, and then systematically mixed with the iron ore and other raw materials used in the steel production process. The metal products sold by the Crane Steelworks, the very rails and beams that were building the new America, literally contained the ashes of his murdered victims. This final, unspeakable revelation explained a long-standing mystery of the steel industry: the superior, almost preternatural quality of Crane's steel, which competitors had been unable to replicate. The high calcium phosphate content of the human bone ash, when added to the molten steel, created an alloy of exceptional strength and durability. Bartholomew Crane had not just built his fortune on the backs of his victims. He had built it out of their very bones. The realization that she had been living, for 3 years, in blissful ignorance directly above this house of slaughter, this human processing plant, shattered Rebecca's world. The man she had married, the father of her children, the man who had wooed her with poetry and intellectual discourse, was not just a criminal. He was a monster of a kind she had never imagined could exist, a being whose depravity seemed to defy the very limits of human evil. But through the fog of her horror, a cold, fierce resolve began to crystallize. Her shock was matched and then surpassed by her determination to burn his evil empire to the ground. She spent the remaining days of Crane's absence in a fever of frantic, meticulous activity. She created detailed, hand-drawn maps of the entire underground complex, noting the locations of the guard posts, the machinery, and the prison cells. She compiled a list of the prisoners she could identify, scribbling down names and descriptions. And she began to formulate a plan, not just to escape, but to bring the full weight of justice down upon her husband. She knew she could not go to the local authorities. She had to find a way to alert federal law enforcement, the only power that might be immune to Crane's corrupting influence. Her secret investigation also uncovered the full, terrifying scope of Crane's criminal network. The kidnapping operations were not random acts, but a highly coordinated enterprise, managed through a network of accomplices that included corrupt police officers in multiple cities, unscrupulous shipping agents, and professional criminals who specialized in the vile trade of human trafficking. The network was not confined to Indiana. It had procurement branches in Illinois, Ohio, and even Michigan, making it a multi-state criminal conspiracy of unprecedented scale. And in the final hours before Crane's scheduled return, she made the discovery that revealed the twisted philosophy behind the horror. Hidden in a false bottom of his personal safe, she found a series of private journals. In page after page of his precise, elegant script, Crane laid out the philosophical justification for his atrocities. He did not see himself as a murderer or a slaver. He saw himself as a visionary, a pioneer of a new, more rational industrial order. He wrote of eliminating the wasteful and inefficient aspects of human labor, emotions, family ties, free will, by reducing workers to their most essential function, the production of goods. His writings were those of a man who had methodically stripped himself of all human empathy, a man who viewed other people not as fellow souls, but as biological machines, components to be used, depleted, and disposed of. He wrote, with chilling ambition, of his plans to expand his operations, to create a nationwide network of these hidden, slave-powered factories, a secret empire that would, in his view, perfect the engine of American capitalism. Rebecca understood then that she was not just fighting to save a few dozen prisoners. She was fighting to stop a man who sought to systematically dehumanize the very soul of the nation. When the sound of Bartholomew Crane's carriage wheels crunched on the gravel driveway, announcing his return, Rebecca was waiting. She had made a decision, a choice that would seal her own fate, and the fate of every soul trapped in the nightmare her husband had created. The final terrible confrontation was about to begin.